In the rugged deserts of 1870s Arizona, a young settler woman named Clara Whitfield is taken captive after an Apache raid on a wagon train. The desert had gone silent just before it happened, that uncanny hush that falls before disaster. The morning sun was a pale coin rising above the jagged mesas, and the wind carried only dust and the creak of wagon wheels. Clara Whitfield sat beside her father on the front bench of the lead wagon, her bonnet pulled low against the glare. They were 3 days from the Fort Bowie settlement, bound for a new life that her father promised would be as golden as these hills. Clara had tried to believe him. The journey west had stripped the polish from her old world, from the parlors and pressed gowns of Missouri to the raw edge of frontier life. But she had kept her spirit intact, holding tight to her Bible and to the idea that faith could soften the wild. That morning she was humming quietly, watching the heat shimmer across the sand when the world suddenly shattered into sound. It began with a cry. Not human, but the high, piercing whistle of an arrow cutting air. The wagon beside them lurched as a man fell, his hat flying off into the dust. Then came the thunder of horses, the crack of rifles, the harsh cries in a language Clara had never heard but would never forget. The Apaches came like ghosts out of the rocks, their ponies swift, their faces streaked with red and white paint. In seconds, the peaceful caravan dissolved into chaos. Her father shouted for her to lie flat. The reins slipped from his hands as a bullet tore through the canvas of the wagon cover. Clara screamed his name, but his body slumped beside her before the word left her lips. She remembered the metallic smell of blood, the jolt of the wagon as it hit a rut, the sound of her mother's voice somewhere behind, and then the silence that follows terror. When all the senses go numb, when the dust cleared, it was over. The sun had climbed high and merciless, and the road was littered with broken barrels, torn cloth, and the still forms of the settlers who would never reach the fort. Clara's bonnet had been ripped away. Her hair clung to her face with sweat and dirt. She sat frozen beside her father's body until a shadow fell across her. The man standing there was tall and lean, his hair tied back with rawhide, his skin the color of the desert earth. He carried a rifle across his back and a knife at his belt. But what struck Clara most were his eyes, dark, unreadable, yet not cruel. He looked at her as if weighing a question, then spoke a few words in Apache. She didn't understand. Another warrior approached, older, harsher, gesturing angrily, but the tall one lifted a hand, silencing him. Then he spoke again, slowly in broken English. "You come." No cry. He reached down and pulled her roughly but not unkindly from the wagon. Clara stumbled, her skirts catching on the splintered wheel. Her father's wedding ring glinted in the sand beside her shoe. She wanted to grab it, but the warrior's grip tightened on her arm, guiding her toward the waiting horses. Around her, the other Apaches were already riding away. The raid finished, the spoils taken. Clara climbed behind him onto a small, wiry pony. She didn't know where they were going, only that the desert stretched endless in every direction. The man's scent was of smoke and leather. His shoulders were tense but steady beneath her trembling hands. As the horse broke into a gallop, the world blurred. Wind, heat, tears, until the wagon trail was only a ribbon of dust behind them. She looked once more over her shoulder. The wagons burned like distant candles in the sun. Everything she had known, her father, her home, her name spoken in the soft cadence of safety, was gone. Ahead of her, the Apache said nothing. His name, she would later learn, was Taza, though then he was only the stranger who had stolen her from the world she understood. And as the sun bled into the horizon, Clara Whitfield began her journey into another kind of wilderness, one that would change the meaning of fear, trust and love forever. The first night in the Apache camp felt like a dream Clara couldn't wake from. The air smelled of smoke, sweat, and the faint sweetness of sage carried by the evening wind. The camp was set deep in a rocky canyon, a hidden world carved from stone and shadow. She could hear the murmurs of voices, the occasional bark of a dog, and the distant trickle of a stream that seemed to whisper in a tongue she couldn't yet understand. Taza had brought her here after 2 days of relentless travel. Her body ached from the rough ride. Her lips were cracked from thirst and her wrists burned from the leather cords that had bound them. Yet, despite the exhaustion, fear kept her alert. Every movement, every sound in the camp was foreign and sharp, like the prick of a thorn. She had seen the others glance at her with a mixture of curiosity and disdain, the white woman taken from the raid. Some of the women pointed and muttered under their breath, their eyes hard. The men ignored her, except for one, the elder who had argued with Taza back at the wagons. His name, she would later learn, was Chato, a war leader whose scars told stories older than her country. Taza had spoken to him quietly, in a tone of respect, though Clara could sense tension beneath the surface. When Chato's gaze turned to her, it was cold, like the steel of a blade. He said something sharp, and Taza's reply was firmer, defiant even. The older man spat into the dust and walked away. Taza untied her wrists then, gesturing for her to sit near a small fire. He handed her a clay bowl filled with some kind of stew, meat, roots, something bitter and smoky. Her stomach turned, but hunger was stronger than pride. She ate in silence, trying not to meet his eyes. When she finally dared to look up, he was watching her, not as a captor might, but as someone studying a creature that confused him. His expression was unreadable, but there was no triumph in it. No cruelty. "Why you come here?" he asked suddenly, his English halting. She frowned, unsure what he meant. "I didn't come here," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You brought me." He looked at her for a long time, then nodded slightly as if conceding the point. "Yes, but before, why you come to our land?" The question struck her like a slap. "It's not your land," she said before she could stop herself. Her voice cracked, thin with fear and anger. His eyes darkened, but he did not raise his voice. "This land, mine, my father's, his father's before, you come, you take." He touched the ground with his hand, fingers pressing into the dust. "You take everything." She wanted to argue, to say she wasn't part of any army, that she was only a daughter, a girl who had followed her father's dream west. But the words caught in her throat. Because when she looked around, at the canyon walls, the fires, the quiet pride of the people who moved within this space, she realized he was right. She had come here, and they had lost something because of it. The silence between them thickened. Taza stood, took her empty bowl, and turned away without another word. Later that night, as the fire died down, Clara sat alone. She could hear the distant chanting of a ceremonial song, low, rhythmic, rising and falling like the desert wind. It was hauntingly beautiful, though she couldn't understand the words. She thought of her father's hymns and how different, and yet how similar they sounded when stripped down to their bones. Both voices calling to something unseen. Taza passed her once more before sleep. He set down a folded blanket near her feet without meeting her gaze. She watched him walk to the edge of camp, where he stood like a shadow against the firelight. For the first time since her capture, Clara did not cry. She sat very still, listening to the pulse of this strange new world, realizing that the boundary between enemy and savior, between captor and protector, was already beginning to blur. The days that followed blurred into a long, punishing rhythm, the steady rise of the sun, the hiss of wind through the canyons, the ceaseless sound of hooves grinding against sand and stone. The Apache camp never stayed in one place for long. They moved swiftly, as if the desert itself were their ally, hiding them in its folds and shadows. Clara rode in silence, tied by a leather cord to Taza's saddle, her skirt torn and dust-caked, her lips cracked from thirst. Every night they camped in a new hollow, a dry riverbed, a narrow gorge, a stand of mesquite trees, and every morning before dawn they were on the move again. The sun burned everything bare. Her pale skin blistered and peeled beneath its fury. Her bonnet had long since been lost. Once she had been proud of her fair hands, soft and clean. Now they were cut and calloused, the dirt ground so deep it would not wash away. At first the warriors ignored her, treating her as a burden, something unfortunate but necessary. But the Apache women watched her with sharper eyes. One young woman, no older than Clara herself, handed her a small gourd of water one morning when Taza's back was turned. Their eyes met for an instant, one filled with fear, the other with pity, before the girl slipped away again. Taza was different. He did not speak much, but he was never cruel. When the heat became unbearable, he slowed his horse's pace. When Clara stumbled on rocky ground, he reached for her arm before she could fall. He offered her food, sometimes the portion from his own share, though he always did it in silence, never as an act of kindness to be thanked for, more as a matter of duty. Clara couldn't decide if she hated him or owed him her life. One afternoon, they crossed a flat stretch of land so wide it seemed to swallow the horizon. The air shimmered with heat, and the horse's breath came in harsh snorts. The last of the water was gone by midday. Clara's vision swam, her thoughts scattered. She stumbled beside her horse, too weak to lift her head. The world became a blur of gold and red, sun, sand, sky. When she collapsed, she expected to be left there. She'd heard the stories. Captives abandoned when they slowed the march, lives spent and discarded like empty shells. But she felt strong arms catch her before she hit the ground. Taza knelt beside her, his face tense. He said something in Apache, but the words came through as echoes, hollow and distant. She tried to speak, but her tongue felt thick, her lips too dry to move. Then she felt the touch of water on her mouth. Not much, just a few drops poured from a small skin flask. She coughed, then swallowed greedily. Taza held her steady, tilting the flask again. The water was warm and tasted of leather, but to her it was life itself. When she opened her eyes again, he was staring at her, sweat streaking his temples, his expression unreadable. He said quietly, "No die. You strong?" Clara didn't understand if it was a command or a compliment, maybe both. That night when they made camp, he built her a small shade of branches and cloth near the fire. It wasn't comfort, but it was shelter. She lay awake listening to the coyotes call in the distance, their cries haunting and wild. Her thoughts drifted back to her father, his voice, his promises, and then to the strange man who had given her water when he could have let her fade into the sand. In the wavering firelight, she saw him cleaning his rifle, his movements deliberate and calm. Around him the other warriors laughed and spoke in low tones. He said little apart from the occasional word, his gaze flicking now and then toward her as if making sure she was still there. Clara didn't know if she was his prisoner or his responsibility, perhaps both. But somewhere deep inside, beneath the ache of loss and fear, a new feeling stirred. Not trust, not yet, but something close to it. The desert was cruel, but it had a strange honesty to it. There was no room for lies, no softness in its mercy. And as the stars spread over the endless black of the sky, Clara realized that the man who had stolen her from her world might be the only thing keeping her alive in this one. The sky warned them long before the storm came. At first, it was only a strange stillness, the kind that settles over the desert like a held breath. The wind died, the birds vanished, and even the horses grew uneasy. The air grew thick, smelling faintly of dust and lightning. Taza looked up from tightening his saddle and narrowed his eyes toward the horizon, where a dark band of clouds had begun to rise like a wall of smoke. "Go," he said curtly to the others in Apache, pointing east. "We move now." Clara didn't understand the words, but she could feel the urgency in his tone. The warriors mounted quickly, and within moments the small band was riding hard through the desert basin, the first gusts of wind tugging at their hair and blankets. Behind them, the storm built like an army. By the time they reached the base of the red cliffs, the sky had turned a deep, bruised gray. The wind came in screaming gusts, whipping sand into their faces. Clara clung to the horse's mane, her eyes squeezed shut as grit stung her skin. The air smelled of rain, heavy, electric, alive. Taza shouted something and veered off toward a narrow crack in the cliffs. The others followed, leading their horses into the shelter of a hidden canyon that wound deep into the rock. Thunder rolled overhead, echoing through the narrow walls like the growl of the earth itself. When they finally stopped, Clara slid from the saddle, her legs trembling. She had never seen rain like this. When it came all at once, a curtain of silver slashing across the canyon mouth. The desert floor hissed under the onslaught, turning to mud within minutes. The warriors worked quickly to build a small fire just inside a cave at the canyon's edge. The air inside was damp and cool, smelling of clay and old smoke. Clara stood near the entrance, shivering uncontrollably, her clothes soaked through. She didn't know whether to stay or to flee deeper into the shadows. Taza noticed her hesitation and motioned for her to come closer to the fire. "Cold," he said simply, gesturing to the flames. "You sit," she hesitated. The others were already huddled in small groups, their faces turned away, their words low and musical in a tongue she still couldn't follow. She felt like an intruder in someone else's dream, but the cold was gnawing at her bones. She stepped closer, settling a cautious distance from the warmth. The firelight flickered over the walls, revealing the faint traces of ancient drawings, horses, spirals, human figures dancing in faded ochre and black. She stared at them, trying to imagine the hands that had painted them, long before she or Taza or any of this had existed. A sudden crack of thunder made her flinch. Taza turned toward her, his face lit by the fire, eyes reflecting both flame and storm. Without a word, he stood and moved to the corner of the cave where a bundle of woven blankets lay. He pulled one free, a thick patterned one dyed in red and brown, and returned to her side. He held it out, his expression unreadable. She hesitated again, unsure if it was a command or an offer. Finally, she took it. The fabric was rough but warm, smelling faintly of smoke and cedar. She wrapped it around herself, the shivering easing slightly. Outside, lightning flared, a white flash that turned the canyon mouth to silver. The storm howled like something alive. She looked up at him then, her voice small, trembling. Where will I sleep?" For a long moment he didn't move. The rain drummed on the rock above, steady and unrelenting. Then slowly he crouched beside her, lifted one edge of the blanket and said softly, not in command but in something closer to reassurance, "Right here." His tone was gentle, almost protective. He didn't touch her. He didn't need to. The gesture itself, the shared warmth, the wordless understanding, said everything. They sat that way for a long time, listening to the storm beat itself against the canyon walls, until the thunder faded and the fire burned low. Outside, the desert drank deeply of the rain, and inside the cave, two enemies shared the same fragile warmth, not yet trusting, not yet forgiving, but bound for the first time by something older and stronger than fear. The rain did not stop that night. It came in waves, soft at first, then fierce, hammering the cliffs as if the sky itself were trying to split open. The small fire sputtered under the damp air, filling the cave with the scent of wet earth and smoke. Clara sat wrapped in the blanket Taza had given her, her knees drawn close to her chest. The rough weave itched against her skin, but the warmth was a mercy. Across from her, Taza crouched near the fire, feeding it scraps of dry wood. His face flickered in the glow, calm, unbothered by the storm, eyes steady like the desert stones outside. Every now and then, thunder rolled close enough to make the cave tremble. Each time Clara flinched, and each time Taza's gaze flicked toward her, silent but watchful. Hours passed like that. She was too tired to speak, too cold to sleep. When she finally did find her voice, it came out small, uncertain. "Why did you take me?" she asked. The question hung between them, half swallowed by the storm. Taza didn't look at her right away. He set another branch in the fire, watching the sparks leap upward before answering. "Not me," he said finally. "My people take you, but you let them." He lifted his head then, meeting her gaze. His eyes were dark, unreadable, but there was no cruelty in them. "Only truth." "Yes," he said simply. "I let them." "Why?" she pressed, her voice trembling not from cold this time but from anger. "I did nothing to you. I didn't come to steal your land or burn your homes. I just wanted to live." Taza looked back at the fire, his jaw tightening. "You come because your people come. Always more. Always take." He paused, then added more softly, "You think you are one, but you are all. Same." The words stung. She wanted to deny them, to insist she wasn't like the soldiers or the men who built towns on stolen ground. But deep inside, a part of her knew he wasn't wrong. Her father had called the desert empty land, had spoken of taming it. She remembered the way he'd looked at the mountains, not as something sacred, but something to be conquered. She said nothing. The silence stretched between them again, thick as the storm outside. Finally, Taza spoke, his voice quieter this time. "My brother died last winter. Soldiers burn our camp. Take horses, take food. My mother died from hunger. You ask why I let them take you? Because I have lost everything. Because your people have taken everything." He said it without hatred, not as an accusation, but as a fact carved into the shape of his life. Clara swallowed hard. She could feel his pain like a weight in the air. "I'm sorry," she whispered. It sounded useless, childish, but she meant it. Taza looked at her again, studying her as if trying to decide what kind of creature she really was. Enemy, ghost, or something in between. His gaze softened almost imperceptibly. "Not all white people bad," he said after a long pause. "But many forget to see." "See what?" He pointed to the mouth of the cave where the rain shimmered silver in the firelight. See the land. See each other. For a while neither of them spoke. The fire crackled. Outside, the storm began to fade, leaving behind a hush so complete it felt sacred. Clara shifted slightly, pulling the blanket tighter. Her voice broke the silence once more, softer this time, almost shy. "Where will I sleep?" Taza turned to her, his expression unreadable. He hesitated, then lifted one corner of the blanket he had wrapped around himself and said quietly, "Right here." The words weren't an order. They were an invitation, an offering of warmth, not possession. He made space beside him, keeping his gaze fixed on the fire. When she hesitated, he nodded once, slow and sure, as if to say, "You are safe." She moved closer, careful, uncertain. Their shoulders brushed, and for the first time since the raid, she didn't shiver from fear. The storm outside drifted into a whisper of rain. The firelight softened, and in that fragile stillness, Clara realized that something inside her had shifted. Not a surrender, but an understanding. In the heart of the desert, two worlds had touched, and neither would ever be the same again. Morning came quietly after the storm. The desert washed clean. The air smelled of wet sage and earth, a rare sweetness that lingered after the rain. Shafts of sunlight spilled through the canyon mouth, catching on droplets that clung to the rock like beads of glass. Clara woke beneath the blanket, half dreaming, her body sore but warm. For a few blissful seconds she forgot where she was. The sound of trickling water, the faint murmur of voices. It might have been any morning in her old life. Then she opened her eyes and saw the cave walls, the traces of last night's fire, and Taza sitting a few paces away, sharpening a knife on a stone. He turned when she stirred, and their eyes met. He didn't speak, but something passed between them. Not a greeting, not even acknowledgement, but a quiet knowing that neither fully understood. Outside, the camp was already stirring. The storm had forced them to delay their journey, and now the warriors moved with restless purpose. Horses were being readied. Supplies were tied into neat bundles. Clara rose slowly, clutching the blanket around her shoulders. The air was cool, but the sun's edge was already sharp, hinting that the heat would return soon enough. She followed Taza out of the cave, unsure what she was supposed to do. He handed her a small clay cup filled with water from a nearby pool. She drank it gratefully, careful not to spill a drop. When she handed it back, he nodded, a wordless exchange of gratitude and duty. They didn't talk much that day. The path wound high through the red cliffs, narrow and treacherous. The storm had carved rivulets through the sand, turning the trail into a lattice of glistening mud. Taza rode ahead, guiding her horse by the reins. The others glanced back at her now and then, their expressions unreadable. There was no hostility, not anymore, only quiet curiosity, as if they, too, were unsure what to make of this strange woman who did not fight or weep anymore. By midday, the heat returned, heavy and suffocating. Clara's clothes stuck to her skin. Her throat felt lined with dust again. When they stopped to rest in the shadow of a large rock, she slumped to the ground, exhausted. Taza came over and handed her a strip of dried meat. She hesitated before taking it. "Thank you," she murmured. He watched her chew for a moment, then said, "You learn fast." She smiled faintly, though she wasn't sure he meant it as a compliment. "I have to," he nodded. "Desert teach quick, or kill slow." Something about the way he said it, calm, certain, made her shiver. He wasn't warning her. He was reminding her of a truth the desert had carved into both of them. As the sun lowered, they continued on. The landscape changed. Wider plains now, dotted with cactus and pale green shrubs. The sky stretched endlessly above, too big to belong to any one world. That night, they camped beneath a grove of mesquite trees, their branches still dripping from the rain. The firelight painted everything gold and shadow. Clara sat apart, watching the others laugh and share food. She could almost pretend she was invisible, a ghost watching life go on without her. Then Taza approached and sat beside her. For a while, neither spoke. The silence between them was no longer awkward. It had become its own language. He handed her a small carved piece of bone. It looked like a tiny bird, its wings spread. "For you," he said. She turned it over in her hands, surprised by the delicacy of it. "Did you make this?" He nodded once. My brother used to carve. I remember. There was something raw in his voice. Not grief exactly, but memory worn smooth by time. It's beautiful, she said softly. He looked at her then, his eyes steady and dark. You see, he said. See what? She asked. The world. He replied simply, not with fear. With eyes open, Clara felt something inside her loosen. A small, trembling thing she hadn't realized she was holding. Maybe it was hatred. Maybe it was sorrow. When he rose to leave, she stopped him with a quiet word. Taza, he turned. I'm still afraid, she said. But not of you. He said nothing, only gave the faintest nod before walking back toward the fire. That night, Clara lay beneath the stars, the tiny carved bird clutched in her hand. The desert was vast and silent, but for the first time since her capture, she did not feel lost within it. Somewhere between words and silence, she and Taza had begun to understand each other, not through language, but through what neither could say aloud. It wasn't love yet, but it was something that might one day grow into it. That night, the wind was gentle, carrying the scent of mesquite and the faint hum of distant coyotes. The stars stretched wide above the desert, so many that the sky seemed alive with them, pulsing and endless. The Apache camp had settled for the evening, their fires small and steady, their voices low and melodic. Clara sat near the edge of the fire circle, her knees drawn close, watching the flames dance and twist. The days of fear had softened into something quieter, though uncertainty still clung to her like dust. She had begun to understand fragments of the Apache language, a few words, a few rhythms, enough to recognize laughter, scolding, or a song of mourning. She was no longer treated as an outsider to be feared. The women had begun to share food with her, sometimes even smiles. The children, curious and bold, would come close to stare, whisper, and giggle before darting away. Taza had said little, but his presence had changed something. His quiet respect seemed to shield her from cruelty, though she didn't understand why he bothered. That evening, as the fire burned low, he approached and sat beside her. The air between them was warm with the scent of smoke and dust. For a while, neither spoke. They had grown used to silence together, the kind that didn't need filling. Finally, Taza broke it. You come from far, he said, his English slow but sure. Clara nodded. Missouri. He frowned slightly at the unfamiliar word. She smiled faintly, then explained. It's green there. Trees everywhere. The air is soft and it rains often. Not like here. Taza poked at the fire with a stick. Too soft, he said with a small smirk. Land make weak. Clara laughed. The first real laugh she had allowed herself since the raid. Maybe you're right. But it's home. He looked up at her then. You miss? She hesitated, the word catching in her throat. Yes, she said finally. But it isn't there anymore. My family. She stopped, unable to finish. Taza said nothing for a while, just watched the fire crackle. Then quietly he began to speak, not looking at her but at the flames. When I was small, he said, we live near river. Many trees. My brother and I catch fish. My father teach us to ride. At night my mother sing, songs of the sky people. His voice softened. Then soldiers come, take land. Say we go to new place. They lie. Clara listened, her chest tightening. They burn our camp, he continued. My father fight. He die, my brother too. Only me and my mother left. She not live long. His gaze hardened, but not with hatred, with memory. That's why I fight. Not for killing, for remembering. The fire popped, sending up a shower of sparks. The night was so quiet that Clara could hear her own heartbeat. I'm sorry, she said softly. He turned to her, his eyes deep and steady. You not do this. No, she whispered. But my people did. Taza studied her face for a moment as if weighing her words. Then he nodded once, a small gesture of understanding. You see? He said. I see, she answered. For a long while they sat in silence, the fire painting their faces in amber light. Above them the stars wheeled slowly, ancient and constant. Clara thought of her father's Bible stories, of forgiveness, of finding light in wilderness. But this, she realized, was something different. What passed between her and Taza was not forgiveness. It was recognition, two wounded souls looking across the same fire and seeing the shape of loss mirrored in the other. Taza handed her a small stick of sage, its scent sharp and clean. For dreams, he said. You burn. Smoke keep bad spirits away. She took it carefully. Do you believe that? He gave a faint smile. Maybe. Or maybe it just smelled good. She laughed again quietly. The sound carried into the night like a soft thread of light. When the fire finally died down, Taza rose to go, but for a moment his hand brushed her shoulder. Not in command, but in comfort. As he disappeared into the dark, Clara held the sage to her heart, her eyes stinging not from smoke but from something deeper. The desert, once cruel and empty, no longer felt like a prison. It had become a mirror, showing her what was fragile and what could still endure. The peace of those nights didn't last. By the end of the second week, the Apache scouts returned to camp with faces carved from stone. They spoke to Chato in quick, clipped tones, their voices taut with warning. Clara couldn't understand the words, but she didn't need to. The shift in the air said enough. Men began checking rifles, women gathered supplies, children were silenced. The camp was moving again. Taza found her near the stream where she had been washing her face. His steps were fast, urgent. Go, he said, motioning toward the horses. Soldiers come, her heart lurched. Soldiers, how? He shook his head. No time. You ride. They packed what they could in minutes. Smoke still rose from the dying campfires when they mounted up and rode hard across the desert plain. The sun was barely rising, the light sharp and cruel. But Clara could already feel the tremor of fear in the group, that cold, silent knowledge that they were being hunted. Behind them, faint at first, came the echo of hoofbeats. At midday, the Apaches took shelter in a ravine, narrow and steep. The horses were restless, snorting at the smell of sweat and gunpowder on the wind. Clara crouched low beside Taza, trying to slow her breath. Her whole body ached from the ride, but she didn't dare complain. They find us? She whispered. Maybe, he said. His eyes were sharp, scanning the horizon. They want you. The words struck her harder than the fear itself. Me? He nodded. You white. They think you need saving. A bitter laugh escaped her throat before she could stop it. Maybe I do. Taza turned to her then, his expression unreadable. You safe here. Not with them. She wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, that those men in blue coats were her people. But the truth tangled on her tongue. What would they do if they found her? Take her back to what was left of her world? Treat Taza as her captor and hang him for it? The thought made her stomach twist. The sound of rifles cracked across the open desert. The soldiers had found them. The first volley hit the canyon wall, splintering rock. Horses screamed. The Apaches returned fire from the ridges, their shots echoing like thunder. Dust rose in thick clouds. Clara coughed, pressing herself flat against the earth. Taza, she called out, barely hearing her own voice. He was crouched a few yards ahead, firing steadily, his movements smooth and precise. Bullets tore through the rocks near him, sending shards flying. Then one struck close, too close. Taza dropped behind the ridge, clutching his arm. Without thinking, Clara ran to him. You're hit! He shook his head, grimacing. Just skin. Blood darkened his sleeve, but his eyes stayed clear, focused. A new sound rose then, a shout in English. Surrender! We've got you surrounded. Clara froze. The voice carried the clipped authority of an officer. The soldiers were closing in. Taza met her gaze, breath harsh. If they take me, I die. She stared at him, the truth crashing down like the storm they'd once shared. He wasn't wrong. The soldiers would see only a savage, not the man who had given her water, food, safety, who had shared the same firelight and silence. The gunfire slowed. The soldiers were moving closer, cautiously, certain their prey was trapped. Clara's mind raced. The sight of Taza's blood, the echo of his words, "You safe here," and burned through her. Then she did the unthinkable. She grabbed his arm and hissed, "Come on." What? There's another way, that narrow gap behind the rocks. Go. He hesitated only a second before following. They moved low and fast, slipping through the shadows as bullets cracked behind them. The path was barely wide enough to crawl through, but beyond it lay open land and freedom. By the time the soldiers reached the canyon, the two were gone, their tracks swallowed by wind and sand. They rode through the night, wordless, driven by instinct and the pounding of hooves. Clara's hands were raw from gripping the reins, but she didn't let go. When dawn finally broke over the desert, painting the world in pale gold, she looked at Taza slumped in the saddle beside her, wounded, silent, alive, and realized the truth she could no longer deny. The soldiers were her people by blood. But the man beside her, the one she had once called her captor, was now the only home she had left. The desert stretched endless before them, quiet again after the violence. The wind had stilled, and the horses moved with the slow, weary rhythm of creatures that had outrun death but not exhaustion. By noon, the horizon shimmered in heat. Taza's wound had worsened. The blood had dried into a dark crust on his sleeve, but Clara could see how tightly he held his arm against his body, his face drawn with pain. She tried to make him stop, but he shook his head each time, muttering, "We ride. Not safe yet." When they finally reached a dry riverbed, he allowed the horses to rest. Clara slid from her saddle, her legs trembling. She went to him and saw the wound clearly for the first time, a deep furrow across his upper arm. Angry and swollen, "Let me help," she said. He didn't protest, though his jaw tightened as she tore a strip from her petticoat and cleaned the wound with water from her canteen. His skin was warm beneath her touch, his pulse steady but strong. When she wrapped the makeshift bandage, his fingers brushed hers. Light, accidental, but the contact sent something through her chest that she couldn't name. When she was done, he exhaled softly. "Good," he said. "You learn fast," she smiled faintly. "The desert teaches quick," she said, echoing his words from days before. That drew the smallest hint of a smile from him. Then his eyes flicked to the west. "They come," he said quietly. Clara turned, and her heart nearly stopped. In the far distance, she could see the dust rising again. Soldiers. The shimmer of sunlight on metal glinted faintly in the haze. "How?" "They follow tracks," he said. "Always follow." They had maybe an hour. 2 if they were lucky. Taza stood unsteady but determined. "You go. They want you, not me." She stared at him. "No. You go back. Say you escape. They let you live. And you?" He didn't answer. He didn't have to. She could see it in his eyes, the resignation of a man who had lived his whole life being hunted, who expected nothing but death from those who wore the blue coats. "Taza, they'll kill you." He looked at her then, his gaze calm and steady. "Better die free than live in chain." Her throat tightened. "No," she said again, firmer this time. "Not after everything. Not after—" She couldn't finish. He took a step closer, his voice low. "You don't belong here." "You go home," Clara shook her head. "I don't have a home. Not anymore." For the first time, his composure broke. His hand clenched at his side, his jaw flexing. "If you stay, you die. Then we die together," she said. The words came out before she could stop them. Reckless, fierce, true. Taza stared at her, disbelief flickering in his eyes. Then something else, something softer, deeper. "Why?" She met his gaze without flinching. "Because you saved me. Because you saw me when no one else did. Because you're the only one who hasn't lied to me." He was silent for a long moment, the desert wind whispering between them. Then slowly he reached out and touched her cheek, a hesitant, trembling gesture as though afraid she might vanish. "You, strange woman," he murmured. She laughed through the tears that burned her eyes. "So they tell me." They rode again, pushing east toward the hills, the soldiers a ghost on the horizon. But as the sun fell, Clara knew the chase would not end. The world she had come from and the world she was now part of could not exist together. At dusk, they stopped in a narrow canyon. Taza turned to her, his face shadowed in the fading light. "If they find us," he said quietly, "I fight. You run." She met his gaze, her voice steady. "No, I stay." For a moment, he looked at her as if seeing her for the first time. Not as captive or burden, but as equal. His eyes softened, and in them she saw the reflection of everything they had endured. The firelight, the storm, the silence that had become understanding. Whatever happened next, the choice was already made. Clara Whitfield, daughter of settlers, woman of 2 worlds, would not return to the one that had taught her fear. She would stay in the desert, not because she was trapped, but because she had finally found the only truth that mattered. Freedom, she realized, was not a place. It was a person, and for her it wore the face of an Apache named Taza. The night fell silent, vast and endless, a sea of stars stretching from one horizon to the other. The desert glowed faintly under the moon, its sands turning silver, its shadows deep and watchful. Clara sat beside a small fire, the flames low, her body wrapped in Taza's blanket. The scent of sage still clung to it. He was resting a few feet away, his arm bound and his breathing even but shallow. The chase had stopped hours ago. The soldiers had turned back at the mountain's edge, unwilling to venture into Apache lands. For the first time in days there was peace. Fragile, breathless peace. Clara watched the fire and thought about the world she had left behind. The neat rows of fences and church bells, the soft talk of neighbors who never looked past their own walls. The idea of civilization had once been her compass, her safety. Now it felt like a cage. The desert had stripped her bare, her fear, her pride, her illusion, and in their place it had given her truth. A truth written not in laws or prayers, but in silence, endurance, and the fierce will to survive. She looked over at Taza. His face, even in rest, held that same quiet strength, the kind that came from living close to the earth. He stirred, opening his eyes to find her watching him. "You not sleep," he said softly. She smiled. "Not yet." He pushed himself up, grimacing a little. "You think too much." "Maybe," she admitted. "Maybe I've never really thought at all until now." He regarded her in silence, then nodded toward the horizon. "But when sun comes, we go north. My people there, safe. Will they accept me?" she asked, her voice hesitant. He hesitated too, then answered honestly. "Some yes, some not. But I tell them you brave." Clara laughed quietly. "Brave? I don't feel brave." He looked at her for a long moment. "Brave not mean no fear," he said. "Brave mean walk with it." The words settled between them like a promise. The fire burned low and the night grew colder. Clara pulled the blanket tighter. The same blanket he had once lifted for her under the storm. The same one that had become their small world of safety. She whispered half to herself, "Where will I sleep?" Taza looked up, the ghost of a smile in his eyes. "Right here," he said again, his voice low, steady, certain. Something in her heart broke and mended at the same time. At dawn, they rode. The desert stretched before them, raw and beautiful. The mountains rose like sentinels to the north, the promise of shelter beyond them. They rode in silence, the horses' hooves soft on the sand, their shadows long and intertwined. For a time, Clara looked back, to the south, to the faint memory of the world that had once claimed her. The smoke of the soldiers' camp was a thin gray thread in the distance, fading into sky. Then she turned forward and did not look back again. Years passed. Travelers spoke of a white woman seen among the Apache, her hair sun-bleached, her skin bronzed by the desert, her eyes carrying both sorrow and peace. Some said she had married a warrior. Others said she lived alone after he fell in battle. No one could say for certain, but sometimes, in the deep of night, near the canyons where the wind sings through the rocks, riders claimed they heard voices carried on the air. A woman's question and a man's quiet answer. "Where will I sleep?" "Right here." The desert kept its secrets, as it always had. But for those who listened closely, its echoes told a story. Not of captivity or conquest, but of two souls who found each other where no one else would dare to look.